Hoje é a segunda sessão deste simpósio dedicado a Jean-Luc Godard, à qual o Lisbon and Still Film Festival dedica uma retrospectiva integral que tem vindo a decorrer em vários cinemas, nomeadamente Monumental, Nimas e também na Casa das Histórias Paulo Rego. A retrospectiva decorre ainda até amanhã, alguns filmes que ainda vão passar e várias pessoas que irão apresentá-los, nomeadamente o Alberto Ruiz Samaniego, que está aqui connosco, irá apresentar agora às 2 horas o Abu de Souffle. Jonathan Rosenbaum também apresentará Made in USA. Para esta conversa desta manhã temos connosco Juan Branco, que é advogado, ativista, que escreve para várias publicações e que tem vindo a desenvolver um trabalho também ao longo de vários anos, não só no Tribunal Penal Internacional, como foi até há relativamente pouco tempo o advogado do Juan Assange, e tem organizado no nosso festival vários simpósios, nomeadamente um simpósio que fizemos há alguns anos sobre direitos de autor na era da internet, ou um simpósio sobre vigilância de massas que decorreu há 2 anos e no qual participaram vários especialistas e também filósofos, pensadores, escritores, e esse simpósio foi encerrado com uma conversa com a Julian Assange a partir da Embaixada do Equador. Temos connosco também Alberto Ruiz Samaniego, que é filósofo espanhol e que tem publicado vários livros, nomeadamente sobre fotografia e muito também sobre cinema. O último deles chama-se Las Horas Bellas, que é um verso de Fernando Pessoa, de que ele também acaba, juntamente com José Manuel Mourinho, fazer um filme, Pessoa-Lisboa, que inaugurará uma exposição no Centro de Belas Artes de Madrid, em novembro próximo, e que será apresentado hoje às 19h30 no Cinema Nimas, em estreia mundial. E para moderar um bocadinho esta conversa, Jonathan Rosenbaum, historiador e crítico de cinema, que já esteve ontem aqui connosco. Thank you, the three of you, and we would start with Juan Branco.
Bom dia, vou falar em inglês para talvez facilitar o diálogo com os outros panelistas. As it has been said, I've been working lately with the members of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and one of the important questions that was raised in the frame of this work was the question of the capacity of a certain avant-garde. In this sense, I think we can consider that WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, and others that participate in this movement of hacking and defense of a certain new idea of journalism and transparency in the political systems. So the question that we often ask ourselves is how to gain a certain visibility and the capacity to last as an avant-garde, both without merging into the system and becoming normalized, and on the other hand, without getting killed either factually, either just symbolically by the system we're trying either to change, either to break up. I have met twice Jean-Luc Godard. We published 2 interviews regarding his relationship. A lot of it was regarding his relationship with politics and especially copyright, which is a question that is very important for these persons, for Julian Assange, etc., because they consider that it's part of the same ecosystem regarding the freedom of information, the idea of access to data in the most generic term. It's interesting because we come back to a civilization or to a situation in our civilization in which we can consider that information as a cultural product, to put it in a very capitalistic term, are both in the end just a bunch of data that is fabricated in a way that will have an influence on our culture, on our civilization, etc. And the same constraints and the same revolution applies to our relationship to this data with the internet and the digital era. And in the same way, Jean-Luc Godard has had a very constant position regarding copyright, saying that, for example, this famous sentence, which is that authors have no rights, they only have obligations, and fighting against all, or at least declaring himself against all kinds of regulations imposed by copyright holders, like the Hadopi law in France, the three strikes law. He has in his films used a lot of other works, especially in the last 20 years, directly, which means by taking off bits of information or data from other systems produced by other filmmakers, other artists, in order to implement and recompose themselves in his works. And what WikiLeaks and Julian Assange do is kind of the same thing, which means, in a sense, stealing information that belongs to an originary system in order to recompose it and try to change the system in which they insert themselves. So this is maybe a first idea of connection between them. On the other hand, more prosaically, Julian Assange had never seen a movie of Godard 2 years ago, so it's not as if there was a direct connection between them, and I have not spoken about it, about Julian Assange with Godard. But in a more general way, what is interesting with Godard is the fact that he's one of the few avant-gardists that in any sphere was able to create an enormous, to extract an enormous attention and to be able to construct a career and a radical career and to be able to make radical choices thanks to an initial exposition and initial adoration, a capacity to create an adoration through his first movies, which, although being extremely radical and in rupture with the aesthetics of the time, were able to immediately catch the attention of the public and to create such a degree of fascination that he was then able for more than 50 years to build a cinematography that went through very much less visible and shareable, in a sense, proposals with the general public. And it's extremely interesting because sometimes avant-gardes have not this possibility, have not this initial access to the general public, but also the media, etc., and are not able to build a support that will help them to keep on innovating and looking for new forms of aesthetics, of formal and fundamental proposals. So I think this is a very fundamental fact in Godard's career, and the interesting part is that, yeah, he used this liberty he had to keep on looking for new boundaries instead of using it to become conventional, as I, for example, consider Truffaut did, which means like they all had at the same time a kind of similar exposure. And we can see how the filmography of Truffaut followed a much more traditional, or in a sense conventional path than the Godard one, explaining their rupture, because I think it's the most normal and comfortable thing to do when you're a human being, which is just to, once you have felt the appreciation and the enormous amount of attention attention span that you can get by doing things that please the people, either for the good or the bad reasons, to be able to escape that and keep on constructing things that can be interesting. And I mean, I really believe that all avant-gardes face the same issue, with always people that keep on following the same radical path and other than end up abandoning at some point. Julian Assange, for example, has been confronted to that. He had this enormous attention span with his first publications in 2009, 2010 regarding the US crimes committed in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he could have stopped there. He was earning prizes from Amnesty International. He was earning prizes from The Guardian, The New York Times, Le Monde. I mean, he was this generally loved figure. And he decided, and so he had found this momentum. And this is something that, for example, Edward Snowden found, the person that revealed the NSA spying all over the world. He reached this momentum and he decided to maintain himself in it. He decided not to go further. And he decided that he wanted to use this attention he had to just first save himself, which is of course explainable and honorable, and to in a sense finish his fight here. And Julian Assange, on the contrary, tried to push forward, to go further. It immediately triggered an enormous violence as a counteract, as the French Nouvelle Vague received a few years once the initial movement was created and was losing a part of its grip on the national population and international, and he pushed and he pushed, so he got more and more accused, more and more, his freedom was more and more reduced, and he, in a sense, he benefited, and I would like to talk about that. He benefited on this radical revolution, technological revolution that allowed him to keep on going, to keep on pursuing. Although in a classical system, he should have been either dead or completely silenced. But because there was these new ways of communicating with people, and he was able to pursue in his very radical perspective, and he was able to push further the boundaries of transparency, in his domain of his ideas, which are extremely radical and could completely, if pushed until the end, could completely change our political systems, actually. And I mean, a lot has been said regarding the French Nouvelle Vague about how it had been possible for them to have this initial movement thanks to the fact that the new material would allow them to go out of the studios, to be able to film outside with lighter crews and lighter cameras, etc. And Godard found a second, after the political period that followed the first part of his career, he found a second source of inspiration, source of movement, sorry, not of inspiration, through video, which is in a sense what allowed him to continue doing different projects in my perspective, at least. I think like through this usage of video and the usage of this new technology was able to push him to create a new forms of art, and that's where actually the mashup works of Godard started taking more and more importance until today. That doesn't mean he abandoned traditional filming in between commas, but on the other hand also this traditional filming, like these traditional films made with the rules of the industry, also I think were very much affected by his discovery and use and more intense use of video. So it's a bit of I mean, there are several ideas like that. There's another element I would like, I mean, I've been related to Godard through another important element, which has nothing to do, I think, but maybe not with the previous ones, which is the relationship to violence. The relationship to violence in Godard's work is present almost from the beginning, from Les Carabiniers in '61, in which it is directed, addressed, until its very last works, and even in the 2000s, there are several short films which treat directly about this idea of mass violence and how it was a central question in the 20th century, and I mean how to address it, the question of its representation, and trying to define a new paradigm regarding that. I think, I don't know, you might know better his works than mine, but I think there is a moment in his works in which he puts it at the second, I mean, behind him, and he comes back with the question of the Yugoslavian wars, and this is Forever Mozart, etc., in which he comes back to this to try to seize this question, and then produces these short films about this. And I find it very interesting that I mean, at 30 years old and at 80, like, this question is predominant in almost the same way, and almost with exactly the same problematics in what he in his movies, which is it's all the question of. I mean, in Les Carabiniers, for example, he uses the question of humor, and he tries to make us laugh, I think, in order to make us think about what our love represents, in the sense of how easy it can be to be happy or to laugh in the context of extreme violence, how you can perceive it as a very light thing. And then he tries to push the film to something in which this love becomes more and more difficult to stand, and more difficult to stand without feeling sick about this, having had this love. And so he uses the narrative of the movie and the progression of the narrative of the movie and the mixture already. I think it's the first and one of the only movies in his early career in which he mixes his fictional images with documentary archive images of war, of corpses, of cadavers, etc. And he progressively brings the spectator to a feeling of disgust regarding this violence and the enjoyment he could have had in the midst of this violence. And in the last movies, on the contrary, I think since the beginning, there is a much more, in a sense, even romantic relationship to this violence, or emotional one, in which he tries to, weirdly for Godard, in a sense, try to appeal to our emotions, to feel, makes us feel sad about what.
But don't you think that in the first movies that he made, that had a very strong political commitment, he was working more? But we would never say that Godard works in a group, because he's always very powerful himself. But there were more kind of group work in the Ziga-Vertov group, etc. And in these last ones, he does it it's only his what he thinks, and is alone thinking of it.
I think it's interesting because the very first movies of the early 60s, Les Carabiniers, Le Petit Soldat, which have a very strong political dimension, are completely meta-political in a sense. I mean, there is no addressing of the direct political issues of the, I mean, for example, Le Petit Soldat, the Algerian war is all around, but in no moment he will take a stand on either the French or the Algerians. He shows the destruction of that war and torture can produce, but without trying to give responsibility, etc. Then he comes to a more groupal perspective with the Ziga-Vertov and then the Maoist part and Tout va bien, etc. And then you have, yes, a very strong committal in terms of ethics, in terms of even of purpose of discourse. He pushes a discourse that he defends, that is still actual also. That's a very interesting fact. It's one of the last Mao things that can be heard today. All the rest is completely burnt, and this is still resonates. And then, yes, there is this, it's like, again, as he came back to his 30s, I mean the late 20s and 30s, and decided to take a distance with the political discourse itself and just focused on the effects of politics and on the drama that politics can create. And this has interested me a lot because my researches are on mass violence and the question of how to represent violence. I think he's one of the few filmmakers that actually had an interrogation regarding this issue, that didn't just have the discourse and had a proposal, but he kept on in his work interrogating how to represent itself. Again, almost in a meta discourse regarding this. He didn't come forward with like, this is how you should show it, of course, like Spielberg or Laszlo Nemes did, but really like bringing the spectator to the spectator the interrogation that anyone should feel regarding these questions.
Okay, thank you, Juan. Yeah, and now, Alberto, you're going to tell us more about Histoire du Cinéma, where's much of the things that Juan has already approached, but also this archivistic work Godard has made in many of his films, and here is kind of the zenith of it.
Okay. Vou tratar de falar em português, assim que peço perdão por o meu péssimo português, que estou seguro que é péssimo. vou falar das Histoires de Cinema porque eu creo que é uma obra maior e que, de certa maneira, conflui com o que dizia o anterior ponente, na ideia de que o vídeo, o trabalho da tecnologia vídeo, formaliza um universo que é muito diferente ao do que é o universo fílmico ou o universo cinematográfico. E, nesse sentido, Histoires de Cinema é como um manifesto sobre as potências videográficas. E mesmo eu diria que é um manifesto onde Godard trata de dizer-nos que o vídeo, em certa maneira, é o acto de pensamento das imagens. Cogito ergo vídeo. Há um momento em que aparece essa frase nas Histoires de Cinema. Mas as Histoires de Cinema são muitas outras coisas, não? São também, em certa maneira, uma biografia do século XX, uma biografia focalizada num ponto crítico, num eclipse brutal, que é a Segunda Guerra Mundial, que é o território, o ponto cego para o qual as imagens teriam de enfocar, mas não existe grande produção cinematográfica em torno a esse ponto cego, mas é também um registro, as histoires, em certa maneira, autobiográfico, porque há uma presença muito forte do próprio mediador, ou mesmo Godard, dentro das imagens, que está continuamente manipulando na sua mesa de montagem este universo de infinitas imagens, e mesmo está comentando com essa voz grave, essa voz iterativa, como uma sorte de prece, não sei se de prece, como de orações, letanias,
sim.
Como se fossem letanias,
preces
ou letanias, não? E tudo isso em torno, ou melhor, e tudo isso baixo a forma de um ensaio poético, um ensaio onde o discurso não é em absoluto lineal, sino que zigzagueia e se difracta em uma multiplicidade de ressonâncias, de correspondências, diríamos, se seguíssemos a Baudelaire, de carácter eminentemente poético, como digo. Por outro lado, as histoires são efectivamente uma reivindicação da possibilidade do vídeo, do trabalho tecnológico do vídeo. E nesse sentido, encontramos nesta obra, nesta peça, uma quantidade infinita de modalizacións da imagem. Encontramos sobreimpresión, alternancia de imagens, montaxe de atraccións, montaxe dialéctico, edición por estratos, edición por capas, fundidos, reencuadres, simultaneidade de bandas sonoras, intertítulos, sobrescrituras, subtitulados ou legendados, textos que comentan as imaxes que comentan textos, voces que ecoan o que están mirando, cambios de velocidade, ralentís, detencións, en fin, é todo un abanico, un abano de procesos en torno á escrita cinematográfica verdadeiramente intenso. É un percorrido que é difícil de seguir e que é difícil de superar na capacidade de modalizar todo tipo de procesos, de maneira que diríamos que as histoires son como un inmenso palimpsesto, un gran palimpsesto. Há outro método do qual me gustaría falar nesta película, que é o que eu chamaría o citacionismo, non o situacionismo, sino o citacionismo. Godard é un individuo que está continuamente citando ou recitando miles de documentos, tanto cinematográficos como musicais, como literarios, filosóficos. E trata de establecer afinidades entre eses documentos, ou entre as imaxes e os textos, como se tratase de soltar unha rede onde fose posible capturar a maior parte de información en torno á historia do século XX e da cinematografía do século XX. O traballo do vídeo permite tamén fazer unha coisa que é fundamental, o meu xuicio, nas histoires de cinema, que é que Godard xa non traballa por corte, como traballa o filme clásico, como traballa a cinematografía clásica, sino que traballa por mistura. É un traballo, non é un traballo de tesoiras, sino que é un traballo de araña que vai recabando, recollendo na súa tela todo tipo de imaxes que poidan caer dentro dese proceso. De maneira que esta araña videográfica o que vai a fazer é establecer continuamente novas relacións, a realimentar asociacións, a realimentar correspondencias unha vez tras outra. A araña está a afiar o seu fío continuamente entre cousas que aparentemente poden estar moito afastadas entre sí, moito separadas, pero que ao mesmo tempo son tratadas cunha precisión e cunha proximidade, cunha intimidade mesmo, que lle permite crear, nun sentido casi wittgensteiniano, aires de familia entre todos eses documentos, un parentesco que é histórico, que é simbólico, que é poético, que en último caso é estético. As histoires son tamén un manifesto pro-videográfico porque o gran protagonista da película, depois do propio Godard como gran montador, é a máquina de moviola, é a moviola. E a moviola é o que estamos a escutar continuamente, ese repiqueteo da máquina de facer imaxes videográficas. É moi importante, e isto xa é algo que Godard tiña enfatizado anos antes, que é o carácter manual que ten o cinema, o carácter de manipulación, de proximidade manual que ten o cinema, como se o traballador de imaxes videográficas fose, en certa maneira, como un intérprete musical. E Godard quere xogar un pouco con esa idea de que ele está como tocando un piano no momento en que está misturando esas imaxes. A moviola...
Mais do que ser un maestro.
Sí. A moviola é, entón, como un instrumento que se interpreta, un instrumento que se toca, que se compón, que se interpreta. E o vídeo, entón, sería como unha partitura, unha coisa que se ejecuta, sería en español, non sei como se di en portugués, que se interpreta, unha partitura unha partición que se interpreta. Claro, e logo temos algo do que se falou antes, que é o carácter solitario deste último Godard, o carácter, esta intimidade, esta introspección do que caracteriza tamén o traballo deste home na máquina de manipular imaxes. É evidente que há unha sorte de identificación de Godard cun bello arquivista ou cun monxe medieval que recapitula na fin do século XX e tal vez na fin do cinema mesmo, tal vez na fin mesmo da cultura tal como entendeu Occidente, e este home no seu gabinete, na súa cripta, na súa biblioteca, está indiferente ao exterior, en certa maneira, e na súa soidade, na súa introspección, está recollendo todos eses materiais que proceden do exterior. E entón Godard é como un anacoreta, o último anacoreta, poderíamos dicir, que na súa cámara secreta, na súa cámara hermética, está arquivando e comentando, por decir así, as postrimerías do mundo, as postrimerías do cinema e as postrimerías do mundo. Nese sentido, Godard parece tamén como o último coleccionista benjaminiano. É un intérprete, coleccionista e mesmo unha sorte de chamán, de xamán ou de feiticeiro que vai facer todo tipo de alquimias, de misturas con as imaxes para, en definitiva, producir pensamento. A identificación final desta figura que é el mesmo é a de un pensador que rememora a través das imaxes, que fai memoria viva por medio da manipulación destas imaxes. E nese sentido hai como unha reivindicación, como digo, de carácter manual moi forte deste novo cinema de Godard, e como se fose tamén un último artesano, un artesano que traballa xustamente con as mans. Dúas ou tres cosas já remato. Eu creo que há un sentido, en certa maneira, irónico nas histoires do cinema, irónico con respecto a serie de catástrofes que centraron a historia dos últimos 100 anos de Occidente, e há tamén, en certa maneira, unha sensación de tremenda tristeza ou de tremendo desengano nesta obra casi póstuma de Godard. Nese sentido, a propia forma en que el aparece no film, moitas veces como unha figura en sombra, como unha figura que fala cunha voz moito baixa, moito grave, como dicía antes, é como se fose xa un ser póstumo, un espectro, en certa maneira. El mesmo é como unha sombra do cinema, o último fillo do cinema, ou en tanto que un pensador hegeliano que sempre pensa depois da medianoite, é dicir, como a lechuza filosófica, non sei como se di lechuza en portugués, o bufo, a Minerva, o animal da noite, non sei como se di en portugués, en español é lechuza. Ele é un pouco esa figura do pensador hegeliano que pensa as coisas cando están xa rematadas, cando está xa todo é perdido, todo está acabado. E por iso non ten máis remedio que facer esta función de rememoración, esta función rememorante, como se fose un vello, é un vello solitario que rememora, que lembra unha vez tras outra e que trata de reactualizar os documentos dos últimos 100 anos. E acabo con unha idea que creo que é interesante e que, en certa forma, volve a confluir con o que dicía antes o meu compañeiro, e é a idea de que tamén há unha guerra posível a través do vídeo, que a máquina videográfica é unha máquina de guerra, no sentido deleuziano, no sentido en que Deleuze falaba de máquinas de guerra. E há un sonido da máquina, un son da máquina moito percutente ao longo de toda a obra, de todas as histoires, moi forte, que é moito rítmico, moito insistente, que é como unha ametralladora, no fondo. Há unha correspondencia moito clara, ao meu xuicio, entre o funcionamento das armas de guerra, das ametralladoras, e o funcionamento da escritura videográfica. Porque a máquina videográfica é unha máquina de pensar bélica, é unha máquina de pensar por repetición bélica. E, finalmente, a última idea con a cual termino. O máis interesante de Godard, ao meu juízo tamén, é que Godard é un individuo que metaboliza tudo, deglute tudo, colle este arquivo infinito de documentos e de imagens e desfai tudo, deconstrúe tudo, rompe tudo, para establecer novas formalizacións, novos diálogos. Non houve nunca en Godard, nin no seu primeiro film sequer, non há un montaxe armónico nunca en Godard, non há unha articulación armonizante, sino que há sempre unha tensión, unha violencia continua entre as propias imaxes. Non há unha articulación armónica entre elas. E por iso Godard está continuamente violentando as imaxes. Por iso nunca vemos as imaxes originarias, nunca vemos as imaxes prístinas, sino que as imaxes están remontadas, están recortadas, están reutilizadas, están violentadas. Eu diría que há neste desmontaxe continuo, un proceso de digestión, que é o que permite o vídeo tamén. A enunciación digestiva, poderíamos dicir, de as histoires do cinema. Nese sentido, é como se a función do artista, ou do artista de vanguarda, fose, nun sentido tamén moito benjaminiano, antes que nada a da destrucción, para poder abrir novas calmes, novos camiños. Godard primeiro destrue todo, desfai tudo, e a partir de aí propón novas formas de refazer, de rearticular, de reintegrar tudo iso que antes foi experimentado na forma da destrucción, na forma da desarticulación. Hai unha escritura de Godard, unha escrita, unha enunciación cinematográfica en Godard que se caracteriza, ao meu juízo, sempre por ese tipo de violencias como as imagens, e que está xa en A Bout de Souffle, nos falsos raccords, por exemplo, de A Bout de Souffle. Son moito interesantes porque son tremendamente violentos como canon, como ortodoxia da escrita cinematográfica. Eu creo que esta acción violenta na escrita cinematográfica en Godard é fundamental, e nese sentido as histoires son efectivamente un inmenso volcán onde todo está queimado, todo está solarizado mesmo, todo está deglutido nun inmenso ventre nos momentos finais dunha cultura, nas postrimerías dunha cultura. Gracias.
Obrigado, não. Jonathan?
Well, I'd like to thank both Juan and Alberto for very interesting commentaries. What I'd like to do is, I have a kind of personal history in relation to both Histoire du Cinéma and Godard that I'd like to recount, because I think it touches it'll be a way of leading into, I think, addressing some of the issues that were raised by Histoire du Cinéma. Around the time, I don't remember the actual year, but it was at the time of Godard's feature, which is actually my least favorite of all of his features, Forever Mozart. I was serving on the New York Festival Selection Committee in New York, and received a phone call inviting me to come to Locarno, this was early August, to be on a panel that was selected by Godard about Histoire du Cinéma that was being held at the festival. And because it was Godard that was requesting it, they very kindly and exceptionally made an exception and allowed me to leave our, looking at films all day, for me to leave for just one weekend to go to Locarno to serve on this panel. Godard himself was not in Locarno yet. He was arriving after I left. But it was a very interesting panel. It included a very great Japanese film critic, Shigehiko Hasumi, who's turning 80 very shortly. Raymond Ballor, who's the editor, one of the editors of Trafic. Florence Delay, who's the one who plays Jeanne d'Arc, and André Labarthe. So it was I was very, very privileged to be in this company. But I had also been invited by Godard before the event to go to Rho, where he lives, and to see the most recent episodes of Histoire du Cinéma, which he had just completed. And that I couldn't do because it was, I really had to be around for the work at the New York Film Festival, so I regretfully had to turn him down. Well, the following year, when he came to the Toronto Film Festival with Forever Mozart, which we incidentally had turned down by the New York Film Festival and decided not to show, he brought with him the three most recent episodes of Histoire du Cinéma, not to show publicly, but to show to me in his hotel room, which was quite intimidating, but also very awe-inspiring for me to do. And over 2 evenings, he would, he actually had a very good setup in his hotel room to show them to me. And then we arranged for me to interview him about which we did, and it was an article that was done for Trafic called Trailer for Histoire du Cinéma. And we addressed the whole issue of the video, for one thing, on it, when he said that he thought it was, that video was appropriate for the essay much more, and that it was what he thought video should be and could be and should be, is doing the work of the essay, basically. And we talked about issues of copyright quite a bit. And in fact, the last section of the article that I wrote with the interview ended with a kind of slogan because of using as a kind of pun with Jacques Rivette's first feature, Paris nous appartient, Paris belongs to us. I ended the article by saying Paramount belongs to us. Because it seemed to me that he was, at this stage when he was doing the work, and at this point I was seeing everything but the last episode, and not in their final versions, because then what happened was, he had Gaumont, who owned Histoire du Cinéma, decided they wanted to clear the rights for all the film clips, and also the visual works of art. For some reason, I don't know how this works in terms of the copyright, but they decided not to bother with any of the music or soundtracks from films. For example, you heard large sections of L'année dernière à Marienbad, but there weren't any rights cleared for that. But for everything else, he enlisted Bernard Eisenschitz to actually identify what the clips were and the artworks, and then proceeded to get rights to everything that they could get rights to. In some cases they couldn't because they couldn't afford it or they weren't able to get it. So Godard went back and revised all the episodes with those various other clips from other films. And he even said, because I asked him in the interview, how do you feel if you can't get a certain clip? And he says, it's not a problem, I just find another film, and he wasn't bothered by it. Well, when he finally completed the work, revising the episodes that I had already seen somewhat because of this, he decided to release the audio of Histoire du Cinéma on CDs. And he included my article, but minus the last section, which was about copyright. Which he actually, and he didn't ask me about it either. I just found out about it. And then I wrote to ECM, who issued the CD, and I said, could I please have a couple of copies? And which they kindly said to me. But I was a little annoyed that, because I guess he felt that my talk about the, because they had actually gotten the rights, maybe it made it out of date or whatever. But then I was asked to write an article for Amazon, which was promoting the CD. And what I used was I incorporated almost all of the section that had been cut out as the article, actually, as my little revenge against Godard for censoring me. Assuming it was Godard who made the decision. I don't even know if it was Godard. I think one of the issues that's, in a way, you could even say most contestable, perhaps, about Histoire du Cinéma is the conviction that cinema failed in its historical mission by not doing anything to either reveal what was going on in the death camps during the war or to halt it in any way. That cinema somehow was, he felt that it had a historical mission that it failed at by not being able to sort of reveal to the world what was happening and to do anything to stop it. And I think that it raises a lot of questions, including the question of whether, if there had been film footage of what was going on in the death camps, if this would have made a difference, and who would have seen the footage. I mean, there are a lot of questions that are raised by this, but but it does seem like the one thing that's very interesting, and I mentioned this actually in our earlier session yesterday, was that Godard's attitude towards his own previous work as a critic was not to challenge it, not to modify it, but to see it as part of history. And consequently, there's a certain kind of way in which he sees film history itself as something that's kind of congealed. And even though, for example, that's full of paradoxes, Godard mentioned to me that one of the great discoveries for him in cinema, that something that caused him actually to delay returning to Switzerland when he stayed in Paris for several days, was Kiarostami, and seeing all these films of Kiarostami. And this was during the time he was working on Histoire du Cinema, but there's absolutely no mention of Kiarostami in Histoire du Cinema, because he sees basically what the cinema was for him as a critic during the 50s and so on, as almost the end point of cinema. And that's a very curious kind of, almost you can say, ahistorical dimension of Histoire du Cinema. And when he, curiously enough, and one could even object to this, when he deals with Africa and India, he doesn't deal with African or Indian cinema. He shows you stills or clips from India Song, from, I think, Fritz Lang's The Tiger of Eshnapur. You hear this music, the song of John Coltrane, which is called Africa. But in other words, you see all of these things that aren't Africa and that aren't India, but are Western appropriations or versions of these things. So that there's a certain kind of way in which Godard's version of the history of cinema is a very reactionary one, you could say, because it doesn't. What I compared to Histoire du Cinema in my original talk in Locarno, and which I developed in my article, was comparing it to Finnegan's Wake of James Joyce, because Finnegan's Wake is a work that is written in several languages, and even though it's mainly English, you could really say it's in lots of different languages put together, and it's about the end of language. Really, it's almost like as if you're looking back at language and saying, what was language? And in the same way, Godard is looking back and saying, what was the 20th century? From the vantage point of now. And it's something that's also over. Whereas, of course, you could argue but then he modified it in an interview and said the cinema that we knew, like we say of painting, like from this period and so on. So he's actually trying to, you could say, periodize history, including his own history, and that's what he's dealing with. But at the same time, there's a kind of refusal of what is going on in a contemporary sense in terms of cinema. He basically, the history that he includes has, there's very special privileged moments, which are Italian neorealism, which to me produces the most interesting or the most powerful emotionally of all the episodes of Histoire du Cinema. And then there's one on the new wave, and there's one that deals largely with Hitchcock. But in a sense, video is the substance of Histoire du Cinema, but it's not at all the subject. What video does to the history of cinema, which of course is very crucial, is not addressed at all in Histoire du Cinema. So there's a very funny kind of paradox to the extent to which it's very deliberately the work of an old man looking back, who sees himself as an old man looking back, but who's not really willing to sort of see what place Histoire du Cinema and other videos that he does has in relationship to the late 1990s when he was making the film, or making the work. We don't even know what to call it. Is it a film, is it a video? I think the fact that we don't have a fixed term to describe these things is a reflection of the problem we have in dealing with cinema critically. And even in questions of, I think rights and copyrights are really interesting too, because if we take a line of dialogue from a Godard film, we don't know if it's him who's saying it or him who's appropriating it from somewhere else. And I think that that's very basic to what his work offers, because I think that there's a certain kind of way in which he feels that history has a voice, and putting all these texts together is a way of letting history speak in a very particular way. And he's framing, the speech, but it's not like it's all coming from simply his own creativity, but because he doesn't clarify what words are his sometimes and what words come from other people. It becomes multivocal. And that's why, when you think about it, Histoire de Cinema is a work that exists in several different languages itself. It's in English, it's in French, it's in German, it's in Latin, and there are whole portions that are in Latin. Well, I mentioned German and Italian. So this is another relationship I think it has with Finnegan's Wake. And it also is, Finnegan's Wake is a very obscure work, but it can be also approached very simply. I've discovered that if you play recordings of Irish actors reading from Finnegan's Wake, which exist on records, and there are little children around, they appreciate it quite a bit. They start laughing because a lot of it sounds very funny. And I think that there's a kind of, beneath all the complexity of Histoire de Cinema, there's a certain simplicity that's there too, which is partly what makes it, I think, in some ways, Godard's magnum opus, really. It is a kind of summary, but it's a kind of summary that's compared with the period that immediately follows, like the first period that we discussed yesterday, which was an attempt to engage with the world more directly. I mean, a failed attempt, actually, I think, in a lot of ways, but still one that testified to the desire to change. That you really have a kind of relative disengagement. I think you have a re-engagement with taking up 3D and things like this, because even the types of people who are attracted to see Godard's 3D film are people who might not have seen a Godard film before, but who want to see a 3D film. And I think there's a certain kind of way in which, through various ways, he has managed to do re-engagement of a certain kind since Histoire de Cinema. In any case, I've been talking for a bit, and I'm sure there's some of you have some thoughts about this, so I would love to hear some, or from my co-panelists.
Regarding the question of re-engagement with 3D, I met him the first time just before he was preparing the movie, so he was making, I don't know if you know about this, but he made his own 3D camera with his assistant by joining two small cameras and creating the system himself, and he was showing almost like a kid, like he was having fun with the material itself and trying to show how he had created his own 3D effect. And then, of course, if you see the movie, you see there is a very innovative use of 3D that is probably linked to the fact he owned the material. He had a relationship to the material which allowed him to see what could be done with it. And I think he just, because it was two cameras and not as with the new 3D material, the professional 3D material, a huge camera with two lenses inside, he was able at some point to just move one of the two cameras. And that's one of the most stunning things of Adieu Langage, is when you see that your right eye sees an image that is living, basically, and the left eye is stuck with the first image. But I was talking about that also because in this idea of re-engagement, the last movie he had seen at that moment was Piranha 3D. So he was literally watching all the movies in 3D that had been made, inclusive the most boring Hollywoodian one, to try to find the novelty in them and what he could use as a creative dimension. But it's an interesting thing, the question of video and the use of video and technology, because it's true that in a sense, there are in Film Socialisme, for example, some shots taken from a football match, of the Barcelona match. So there is some shots from what we could call broadcast images but it's a very minor one. And it seems like at no point he really decided to seize himself of this huge flow of new images that started generalizing itself in the 80s with the multiplication of channels, etc. And he maintained this distance and this almost inability to either comment or transform these images is something that could be interesting for his art. And in the same direction, the question of the fact he used video for Histoire du Cinéma, but he wasn't able or didn't want to comment on the video image itself, and then afterwards also in It's Also Movie is a very interesting one. I don't know. because it's in rupture with what he did until then, which was he always had this again this meta discourse on what he was doing. It's in his movies, Le Petit Soldat being the most for me the most revealing of it, in which there is a commentary about cinema in almost every scene, and then there is like as if he had accepted the fact he wasn't anymore in position to keep on having this distance about what he was doing himself.
Well, it's regarding the question of 3D, I was very privileged to have attended early this year a special event devoted to Godard in Zagreb, where we had Godard's major assistant, a Swiss guy who is so modest that I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember his name, but he introduced himself by saying, "I'm not a fan of Godard, but I love working with Jean-Luc." And he showed a test reel that he had done with Godard on trying out all sorts of things on 3D, which were really fascinating. And I think that what's really interesting is that, in fact, it's almost historically maybe relevant that by Godard turning to 3D is another way of going back to his past as a critic, interestingly enough, because 3D came on the scene during the same period when he was starting out as a critic, like in the early 50s. And what you said makes it, amplifies that in the sense that he was interested in seeing all the stuff that had been done with it. So in a way, that's a way of rethinking history to a certain extent. Like if 3D had gone in a different direction back in the 1950s, where, what would that mean? Which is, I think, a kind of a very interesting idea. And not one that I had thought of before as being, having any specific relevance to his last feature. I'm told, I have a friend who's working on the new feature of Godard, Nicole Brenez, who's for photo research. And the last I've heard from him is that, I said, is there any chance that this would be in 3D, the next film? And he said, well, what he's talking about now is it be in 3D and triple screen also. And I know that he shot part of it already in Tunisia, which is interesting.
Well, is there any question from the audience?
Antonio, I would like to, maybe you have an answer, maybe not, about the literary references from Godard, because I think he repeat sometimes some authors, and the way he used those quotes are more than quotes, no, are almost the structure of some of his works. I don't know if you know more about that.
No, maybe Alberto can answer you better than me, but no, as he has already mentioned, the Godard's quotations are more appropriations of the texts he quotes, but not only text, music, images, etc. He's always doing that, and that's one of the influences he had, for example, in some artists, the age of, only to mention people that have come to the festival, Dominique Gonzalez Foster, or Philippe Parrenaud, or the writer Henrique Villamatas. There is a text we have, and so it's an extract of a text we have in the catalog where Henrique Villamatas says, I started to write because of Godard, and Godard was the biggest influence in my writing. As you know, Henrique uses the quotation a lot, and he even invents some quotations that later we discover are being quoted by other people, and thinking that, for example, he invented the quotation of Marguerite Duras, but it was an invention But then some people will use that quotation and will say that it was Marguerite Duras who wrote that, and it was Henrique Villamata saying that Marguerite Duras had been did it. Or, as you can see in the small book Dominique Gonzalez Forster made for the installation she has at the MAT, the Pynchon Park, there is hidden in the text a quotation that was given to her by Henrique Villamatas as if it were a Pynchon line, and it was so even the paranoid are being followed. Persecuted, even the paranoid are being persecuted. And this is something he invented, and that's why Godard has always been doing this in his work, and it influenced many of the artists that came afterwards. I don't know what you have to say about this.
Duas coisas. Eu creo que as referencias literarias en Godard están moi centradas na tradición das primeiras vanguardas, fundamentalmente francesas, non? Por exemplo, as referencias a Apollinaire son continuas, ou a Max Jacob, e hai na propia escritura, cando Godard introduce textos na pantalla, hai un xogo casi caligramático moitas veces, non? Cando corta palabras, por exemplo, memoir, e entón memoir convértese en moi, non? O histoire convértese en toi, e entón este xogo de recortes con os vocábulos é un xogo típicamente dadaísta ou apolinarista ou caligramático, non? Nese sentido creo que as referencias literarias van moi claramente por aí, non? E depois, neste Godard videoartista, as referencias máis que literarias eu creo que son filosóficas, é dicir, há unha presenza moito forte do Benjamin, por exemplo, mesmo do Blanchot, Borges, tamén, son referencias de Simone Weil, son referencias de corte fundamentalmente de pensamento, de reflexión filosófica. Mas há unha outra coisa que eu supoño que terá sido estudiada, pero que eu creo que merece a pena de incidir, que é que, en certa maneira, as histoires de cinema fan un eco cos traballos de Guy Debord. Por iso eu dicía que Godard era un citacionista, non un situacionista, no sentido de que os filmes do Debord están facendo 30 anos antes o que as histoires de cinema en vídeo fixeron depois, non? Con moita máis posibilidades, con moito máis potencial que a tecnoloxía videográfica, non? Pero o Debord presumía de non ter filmado nenhuma das imaxes que utilizaba, é un método de apropiacionismo absoluto, non? E há en Debord tamén, Debord descubre o que o Agamben chama os trascendentais do cinema, non? Que son a parada, a fixeza da imaxe e a repetición. E esas son as dúas estructuras casi nodais das histoires de cinema: parada e repetición.
Em português diz paralítico.
Paralítico. E há unha relación moito mala entre Debord e Godard desde os anos 50. Había unha relación que eu creo que de moita rivalidade entre os dois, non? E había un desprezo de Debord hacia Godard, para Godard tamén moito forte. De certa maneira hai que decir que Debord despreciou a todo, non? Despreciou, non hai... A única persoa que respetou o Debord foi Artur Craván, o poeta dadaísta, o performer. Pero creo que há en Godard, sin recoñecer Godard mesmo isto, há unha forte influencia da escrita cinematográfica dos situacionistas, dos debordianos. E, por dicir así, a utopía do filme situacionista cúmprese ou cumpriuse nas histoires de cinema, con a diferencia de que as histoires están feitas por un home de quase 80 anos, e nese sentido creo que há, non sei se é un forte vínculo de reacción, mas sí que há un desengano, unha idea como se fose un monxe medieval que está cuidando dos documentos antes da destrucción. En medio da destrucción, el, como os vellos freires medievais, guarda o saber cinematográfico xusto no momento en que vai desaparecer.
Yes, your last comment reminds me very much of a wonderful statement once made to me by the Argentinian filmmaker and writer Edgardo Kozarinsky, that he said, when friends copy films for they make copies of films for their friends and give them to them. It's like medieval monks copying illuminated manuscripts, which is keeping culture alive in the Dark Ages. And I think one of the things that's quite interesting, though, I was thinking of, when Juan was talking about the difficulty of Godard, as an avant-garde artist, and at the same time, being able to almost kind of make it into the mainstream, or periodically make it into the mainstream. One thing that a lot of people my age tend to over-evaluate the 60s or overpraise the 60s, saying, oh, if you weren't alive then and weren't seeing the Godard films when they came out, you don't know what it was like. But in fact, all of the Godard films, when they opened in the United States, would close within 2 or 3 days, were attacked by all the critics. And in fact, one of the things that I think is better about the situation in cinema today than in the 60s is that difficult films are actually valued more highly by young people. That actually Bresson has a currency now that he didn't have in the 60s. Someone like Tarkovsky, someone like Pedro Costa, that there's an actual liking for and interest in difficult films. I think what's difficult regarding Godard, though, in this configuration, is that to really appreciate Godard, you have to sort of like know all of his work, or if not all of it, a good deal of it, because it has a cumulative kind of significance and value. And even though some of it, a good many of the features are available, there are a lot of other films that are not, and they came out of order everywhere because of the censorship of Le Petit Soldat, for example, and also just the haphazard release patterns of his work. So I think that there's a kind of way in which so much of Godard is actually centered in a very interesting way. I mean, he may not deal with the present tense in his films now, but he certainly was dealing with them a lot in the 60s. And I think that to understand the 60s, it seems to me one can learn a lot just from watching his films, because I think they're really telling a lot of what was alive and provocative in culture at that moment. But I think it's, I'm basically trying to get a sense of why it's not that he's unknown to younger filmmakers, but I think that there's still something about Godard that eludes them, younger filmmakers. And I'm curious to know, would be curious to know in a sense what that is. I mean, part of it has to do with a number of really radical changes he's gone through. And, one that we haven't cited, but which is a major one, is the move from Paris to a little village in Switzerland, and all that implies, which is another thing we spoke about, that interviewed about. He was saying that even though he still depends on going back to Paris periodically, I think the whole appreciation of nature and even a certain appreciation of classical art is much more pronounced in his recent work than you'd find in the earlier work, which is much more wedded in a sense to pop culture, and even to, for example, to Hollywood. There's a certain kind of way in which emulation and almost worship of Hollywood in the first decade of his work, which he turned against, and then now he has a more modified relation to that. But it still crops up and has some importance, but not quite the same that it used to, I think. Anyway, I'm wandering, so I bet it's time to stop.
Una última cosa, tal vez, sobre la cuestión de la apropiación literaria. Es muy importante porque, Daniel, no te vayas, te voy a responder. Porque evidentemente, es una manera de como impostura genial, ¿no? En Godard, él mismo dice que no lee casi ningún libro en su integralidad. Le encanta hacer ese juego de copias y de citaciones. Hace trabajar gente para que le encuentre citaciones y al mismo tiempo ese trabajo que es como fabricar sentido a partir de cosas que son parciales y de darles un nuevo sentido, es evidentemente, es casi el fundamento de su obra, ¿no? Completamente. Pero, quiero decir, en esa cuestión del contexto, que hay que ver lo que ya se sabe, ¿no? Pero Godard, que viene de una familia gran burguesa en la que la cultura literaria es muy dominante, en la que la fascinación por alguien como François Mauriac, que jugaría un rol importante en su vida, es también fundamental en la primera parte de su vida. Algo muy tradicional, muy pesado de ese lado de transmisión, en la que hay que demostrar que se sabe, ¿no? Que es esa cultura de reproducción cultural burguesa, hay que demostrar que se ha leído, que se sabe, que hay que imponerse tal vez por la citación. Hay una dimensión muy fuerte de ese lado que también puede intimidar y puede explicar el hecho que haya una reacción que puede ser un poco extendida con Godard de una parte de las nuevas generaciones. Y al mismo tiempo, justamente por el lado de esa impostura que no es una, que es del juego permanente sobre esa reproducción. Para mí es algo como la cuestión del heritage en Godard es muy importante, no solamente porque no ha tenido hijos, pero porque es una cuestión que él no trata directamente, pero que se nota a través de esa forma de como retorna, le da la vuelta al problema, ¿no? En vez de prolongar la reproducción cultural que logra otra vez, ha llevado a ser extremadamente convencional, a producir obras que a un momento se hubieran mantenido en la línea de lo que había conocido, de lo que su padre banquero había dicho que había que leer y su madre en esos círculos. Va a seguir esa estela y va a darle la vuelta completamente, destrozando a citas, inventándose entrevistas en sus primeros años en los Cahiers, que es como el escándalo absoluto, ¿no? Como pretende haberse encontrado con grandes realizadores y les ofrece, se inventa palabras que hubieran dicho o autocomentarios de sus obras y luego pues eso va a pretender que ha leído pues todo lo que es posible leer y va a empezar a citar a derecha e izquierda cosas que al final evidentemente ha comprendido, pero de las que él mismo tal vez no conoce el contexto, y esa cosa es tal vez pues un lado muy revolucionario de Godard, que al mismo muy clásico y que abre muchísimas puertas para el que lee a Godard, porque evidentemente dan ganas de leer, primero de estar a la altura del que ha producido eso, es decir, pues si él ha leído todo eso, no solamente es posible, pero si quiero ser tan bueno como él, pues voy a tener que consumir todo eso. Entonces hay como una incitación a la educación extremadamente fuerte y al mismo tiempo pues una radicalidad, ruptura de una educación que él mismo no ha querido seguir, pues, no yendo a la Sorbona, no acabando su curso a Sorbona y rompiendo un poco todos los esquemas que hubiera debido seguir un joven de su época y de su edad, yéndose a trabajar en Suiza que era la construcción de una planta eléctrica, ¿no? De hidroeléctrica y luego filma eso. Y entonces esa ambivalencia creo que es fundamental y tal vez al fundamento de su práctica artística. Y explica eso, pues que al mismo tiempo tenga una relación con autores muy clásicos al principio, que sea eso que lo ha formado, y luego vaya buscando en permanencia pues la radicalidad que sea en literatura o sobre todo en filosofía, con autores como Wittgenstein, y luego también creo que ahí el límite llega pues que se vuelva un clasicismo tal vez muy fuerte con citaciones Quiero decir que no tiene reacción con las avant-garde filosóficas y literarias de su época, tengo la impresión, que es tal vez un límite ahí de esa construcción.
writing a film adaptation, as I think he made with Cortázar, the Argentinian writer. In Weekend, I think he worked on with his work, if I'm not wrong. So.
Sí, o Moravia también, que no era un autor ni revolucionario ni particularmente que siga.
Tiene un relier, Godard.
Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hay también un cierto peligro que creo que, no estoy seguro si lo comentó Alain Bergalá, que es que a veces precisamente toda esta malla que puede resultar muy hermética para el espectador, que puede generar una suerte de barrera para que se produzca una codificación saludable y políticamente positiva. Se intensifica este hermetismo con la figura pública de Godard. Es decir, Bergalá comentaba algo así como que las juventudes francesas, cuando venía Godard a París, iban a ver a Godard y las declaraciones escandalosas o no de Godard, pero no se quedaban a ver las películas de Godard, ¿no? Entonces es como si el personaje se comiese sus propias producciones cinematográficas, o como si tapase sus propios trabajos toda esta figura del gran fingidor, ¿no? En sentido casi pesoar.
I was going to say that I think that it's almost easy to forget this now or not to realize it, but the really most revolutionary thing in some ways about Godard, from a perspective at least that's particularly strong, I think, in America more than maybe even in Europe, is actually bringing film in line with all the other arts. That this was, that even though that film has been considered an art at least since the 20s, you know, in France and even before that, I think in Hungary actually. But in America, it coincides the first real, I can say, really cosmopolitan writer and critic who saw film in relationship to not only to all the other arts, but to philosophy, to intellectual thought, was Susan Sontag, who was the biggest defender in the United States of Godard, and really has a kind of parallel development in a certain way. I think that they were contemporaries, and I think that change, because I think that Godard did make a permanent change in world perception of film, had a lot to do with that. In other words, just his early decision that you can and you must, you know, quote, and you could quote lengthy passages from texts and films, that it was okay to do that you could show paintings, that you could use classical music, you could do all of these things and mix them up. And, you know, I attribute part of this with the really major influence of Henri Langlois, because Langlois at the Cinematheque had the radical idea of you put everything together from all periods, every country, so it's almost like you're saying Otto Preminger and Kinzi Mitsuguchi are sitting at the same table. And it seems to me that spirit is very much present in the work of Godard, that you have, you know, the war in Vietnam and Mozart sitting at the same table, so to speak. And you have, you know, all of these kinds of things that would not generally thought to belong together or should be together, but in fact are constantly together in what we call media, contemporary consciousness, whatever, what have you, that these things are part of the world we inhabit, but they were segregated from each other before Godard. And Godard forced them all, not only forced them all together, he just said they belong together. And I don't think I can't think of any other filmmaker who took that attitude towards culture.
Thanks. Well, it's about time to finish this panel. In the morning, in the afternoon, we will have with us at 3 p.m. Cyril Nira, Alex Ross Perry, and Miguel Marias. Thank you a lot.